Good afternoon. Welcome to the Analyst. Today we'll be taking up 7 newspaper articles from the Hindu and the Indian Express and discussing them. The handout for the same will be available in the description of this video for your kind perusal. Please have a look at that. The first article that we'll take up is related to inequality, as a World Bank report titled India Poverty and Equity Brief has claimed that India has almost eradicated extreme poverty and we have significantly reduced the consumption inequality, especially since 2011-12. The second article is related to tourism sector, as the government plans to increase the share of tourism in the Indian economy to 10% from the present 5%. Additionally, we'll take up 5 articles in the simplified which will be helpful for your prelims and mains preparation. The first article is related to inequality. The context behind it is the World Bank report. The report titled India Poverty and Equity Brief claims that India has almost eradicated extreme poverty and we have significantly reduced consumption inequality since 2011-12. But the critics argue that the World Bank data relies upon the Household Consumption Expenditure Survey, and the Household Consumption Expenditure Survey does not capture the consumption by the rich. Therefore, we'll discuss the arguments related to the World Bank data and the counter opinion as well. We will also delve into the causes and consequences of inequality in India and the suggestions to reduce inequality. This is important in GS3 under the topic inclusive growth and issues arising from it. First, let's discuss what is inequality, what are the dimensions of inequality. Inequality does not mean only income inequality, only economic inequality. It can also be political inequality, it can be social inequality, but today we'll focus upon the economic inequality. As per the United Nations, inequality means the status of not being equal. Not being equal in the matters of status, rights and opportunities. When we look at the facets of inequality in India, it manifests in terms of gender inequality, caste inequality, religious inequality, etc. When we look at gender inequality, we can observe this through the international reports and indices. For example, the World Economic Forum publishes the Global Gender Gap Report, and India ranks at 131st place out of 148 countries as per the Global Gender Gap Report 2025. We can see the gender inequality in terms of the wages gap. As per the ILO data, women get paid 34% less as compared to men for the same work done. And in agriculture also we can see the gender inequality. For example, about 42% of the agriculture labor in India are women, but less than 2% of women own agricultural land. That also portrays gender inequality in agriculture. We can see there is caste inequality. For example, the upper caste households, their household income is about 46% more than the national average. Likewise, we can see religious inequality also. For example, certain religions are well-to-do as compared to the other religions, like the Christians, Jains, Parsis. Their incomes are usually more than the Muslims, Buddhists, etc. We can see there is inequality in terms of ethnicity as well. For example, as per the National Family Health Survey data, about 45% of the ST population has the lowest income. They belong to the lowest income bracket in India. Likewise, the economic inequality can also be seen in terms of the reports by Oxfam, the inequality reports, as per which about 1% people in India own about 40% of the assets. Now, how do we measure the economic inequality? We can use the Lorentz curve or the Gini coefficient. To understand the Lorentz curve, let's have a look at the graphical representation of the percent income in an economy versus the percent population in the economy. If there is perfect equality, then the Lorentz curve will be a straight line, a 45-degree straight line, because every person in the economy has the same income. The bottom 50% of the population will also have the same income as the top 50% of the population. But if there is inequality in the economy, then the Lorentz curve will not be a straight line, rather it will be a curve like this. In this situation, the bottom 50% of the population may have access to just about 10% of the national income, and the bottom 80% of the population may have access to just about 40% of the national income. So the Lorentz curve will be a curve, not the straight line. Now what is Gini coefficient? The Gini coefficient is the ratio of the area between the Lorentz curve and the perfect equality line and the area below the perfect equality line. That is, if this is area A and this is area B, then the Gini coefficient will be equal to A divided by A plus B. Therefore, if the economy has perfect equality, then the area A will be 0, as the Lorentz curve will be coinciding with the perfect equality line, the 45-degree line. In that case, the Gini coefficient will be 0. Therefore, the Gini coefficient of 0 leads to perfect equality in the economy, and the Gini coefficient of 1 means perfect inequality in the economy. Now, when we observe the share of top 1%, the income inequality in India historically, we see that the incomes of the top 1% was declining before 1980. The main reason was the socialist policies after the independence that India adopted. For example, the nationalization of banks, the airline, oil, etc. But if you observe from 1980 onwards, the share of the wealth which is held by the top 1% in India has been increasing. Now, what are the causes of inequality in India? One of the primary factors is inflation. Inflation impacts the poor disproportionately. The reason being, the income growth for the poor is low. The incomes remain stagnant, for example, in the unorganized sector. Like for labor, for agriculture, the income growth is very less. Whereas for the high net worth individuals, the income growth is way more. Another factor is unemployment. Unemployment leads to less income, which further exacerbates the income inequality. Another cause is tax evasion. Because of the high tax rates in India, there is tax evasion, and the money is thus channeled into the black money, the formation of the parallel economy. The black money gets invested into sectors like real estate, which further fuel inflation. If you observe the inflation in the real estate in the past 5 years, it is way more than the rate at which the incomes have increased in the past 5 years. Another factor behind inequality is the regressive taxation, the imposition of the indirect taxes. The indirect taxes like the goods and service tax, they are imposed upon both the poor and the rich alike, which also leads to the increase in inequality. Another factor being the inverted duty structure also, which adversely impacts the industries, especially the small and medium enterprises, and the employment generation further. The agrarian strategy has also increased the inequality because we took up the green revolution, and the green revolution benefits were mainly for the wealthy farmers. The percolation to the poor farmers did not happen. Another factor is the education and social indicators also. The poor employability, the poor skill levels, the poor social indicators, they also lead to the reduced incomes and further increase in the income inequality. Now, what are the consequences of the inequality and the high income inequality in India? It may lead to social conflicts. For example, the coming up of the reservation demands, the demands from the Marathas, Patels seeking for the reservation in government jobs. Another factor can be ethnic movements also. There will be demands for more autonomy. For example, the Nagas demanding for the greater Nagalim, and there are economic reasons also behind these demands. There can be a sense of marginalization as well, especially among the religious minorities, among some religious communities, due to the income inequality. Another consequence can be the poor development indices, the lagging behind in the indices like the IMR, MMR, the nutrition levels, and the income levels therefore. Now, coming to the article, the author gives arguments in favor of the data that the World Bank has claimed. The World Bank report has claimed that we have significantly reduced the consumption inequality in India since 2011-12, but the critics say that it relies upon the household consumption expenditure survey, which does not capture the consumption by the rich. But the author says that we have to acknowledge that the consumption inequality has definitely decreased in India. For example, the consumption of milk and eggs has increased by 45% and 63% respectively from 2012 to 2023. Simultaneously, there has been an increase in the intake of fruits, vegetables and protein products, whereas the share of the cereals in the food bill has come down and the proportion of the healthier products in the diet has gone up. That shows the reduction in the consumption inequality. Also, as per the international poverty line of $3, between 2011 and 2023, India has pulled out 27 crore people out of extreme poverty. And there has been a significant increase in the ownership of the pakka houses and the rural roads, the paved roads in the rural areas, owing to the Pradhan Mantri Gramin Awas Yojana and the Gram Sadak Yojana. And among the poorest 20% of the households, now more than 40% own a vehicle today as compared to 6% in 2011-12. But at the same time, we also have to look at the income inequality as well. But unfortunately, there is no official income survey data, and the media reports and the reports by the economists and the commentators, they usually rely upon the estimates by the World Inequality Lab. But there are concerns with the World Inequality Lab data as well. The author says that it uses the income tax data to estimate the top income levels, and they use the old consumption data and the estimates of income consumption relationship to estimate the income for the low and middle income households. At the same time, the inequality data which are used, they are based upon the pre-tax income levels. But the arguments in the newspaper, they present only one side of the coin. We have to look at the other side as well, as the economists say that the income inequality in India remains quite high. For example, as observed by the noted economist Thomas Piketty, let's look at some of his observations as well. He compares the income levels in India with that of China and Vietnam. Till about 1975, the income levels in India, China and Vietnam were similar. But by 2000, China and Vietnam, they were about 35 to 50% richer than India. And if you observe in 2022, the income levels in China were about 2.5 times that of India. And in Vietnam, the income levels were 33% higher than India's. And simultaneously, there has been a rising inequality in both the wealth inequality and the income inequality. For example, there has been a billionaire boom in the past 3 decades as per Piketty. In 1991, there was just one billionaire. By 2022, there were about 162 billionaires in India, leading to the rise in the wealth inequality. Simultaneously, if you observe the tax filing data, pre-1990, there were less than 1 crore people who were filing tax every year in India. If you observe the data from 2018-19, then there are about 9 crore Indians who were filing tax in 2018-2019 in India. Now, when we observe the income inequality trends, the top 1% income share was just 13% in 1922. This was the colonial peak. This was the highest during the time of the British Raj. In 1982, it fell to 6.1%. This fall is usually attributed to the socialist policies that India took up post-independence, for example, the nationalization of banks and some important industries. But after that, there has been an increase. For example, by 2022, the top 1% income is about 22.6% as per Piketty. Likewise, if you observe the top 10% income share, then since 1951 to 1982, there was a decline from 37% to 30%, but again there was an increase after 1982 till 2022 to about 60%. And if we compare for the bottom 50%, the income share has been declining from 1980s at 22% to about 15% in 2022. Likewise, if we observe the wealth inequality trends, the top 1% wealth share has tripled almost from 1961 to 2022. And for the top 10% also, the wealth share has increased from 45% to 65% over the 6 decades. And the bottom 50% wealth share has almost halved now when we look at the observations on the wealth versus income inequality and compare the top 10% versus the top 10%, then the trend line usually aligns since the 1990s. What does it point? That the wealth inequality and the income inequality has been increasing for both the top 1% population also and the top 10% population also. It points towards the structural inequality rather than the taxation policies doing it. And the top 10%, if we see, the wealth share was 57% and the income share was 42%, pointing to about 15% gap. If we observe in 2022, this gap between the wealth share and the income share halved to 7.3%, which points to the increase in the income inequality for the top 10%. Whereas in the top 1%, there has been a rise in the wealth inequality. The gap between the wealth share which is held by the top 1% and the income share which is held by the top 1% has widened. That is, for the top 1%, the wealth inequality has been increasing rather than income inequality. Now, if we compare the income inequality and the wealth inequality in India with the other countries as estimated by Piketty et al., we see that the income inequality as well as the wealth inequality in India is more than the countries like China, France and UK, etc. Now, what are the suggestions that we can give to reduce inequality in India? One, we should go for the employment generation. Employment generation can come from the boost to the manufacturing sector. As India transitioned from agriculture directly to the services economy, the manufacturing sector was lost in between. Especially the sectors like the textile industry, the toy industry. These industries can employ a large number of people and the employment generation will lead to the increase in the income levels, further reducing the inequality. We need taxation reforms. For this, one, we can go for the progressive taxation, and second, we can go for the wealth tax also on the ultra wealthy people. The civil society role can also be promoted in reduction of inequality. For example, the promotion of entrepreneurship. The entrepreneurship will lead to the employment generation. For example, the giving of loans to the SC/ST entrepreneurs under the Stand Up India scheme. We can also go for women empowerment, as it will lead to the multiplier effects leading to positive developments in the social indicators as well. The skill development to increase the employability and also the government taking up the affirmative action as well. To ensure substantive equality, the government can also make special provisions for the advancement of the socially and economically backward classes using Article 15-16 to ensure the affirmative action. Additionally, the economists like Piketty suggest that we need to take up specific tax reforms also. For example, publishing consistent tax tabulations. The tax data has to be released regularly and consistently. It has been erratic, especially since 1999. And the data also has to be released at the state level as well, disclosing the income sources also. And there should be data transparency. The data transparency will ensure that the decision making, the policy making is informed and evidence based. Plus, there can be the imposition of the wealth tax. As per the estimates by Piketty et al., the imposition of 2% wealth tax upon the 162 billionaires in India can lead to the generation of 0.5% of the national income, additional revenue for the government. And we can take up a caste-based economic census also, which will lead to the generation of more data where the caste-based intersectional inequalities can also be studied and specific policies targeting the welfare, targeting the vulnerable sections can also be framed. And we can go for social investments as well, for example, investing in education, healthcare. And if the inequality is not reduced, we might see an era of a billionaire Raj as observed by some economists, and the billionaire Raj may have more inequality than even the British Raj as observed by the Piketty. Now there is a mains practice question as well. Inequality poses a serious challenge to inclusive growth and social cohesion. Discuss the major causes of inequality in India. Suggest policy measures to address the issue. Please try to write it. The next article is related to tourism sector. The context behind it is that the government aims to increase the share of the tourism sector in the Indian economy. to 10% from the present 5 to 6%. So we will discuss the significance of tourism, the challenges that it faces, and the government initiatives to promote tourism in India. This is important in GS3 under the topic Indian economy and issues related to planning, mobilization of resources, growth, development and employment. Let's first discuss the developments, the evolution of the tourism sector in India. The government first framed the National Tourism Policy 1982. That was to promote tourism, to encourage the states to develop tourist infrastructure, also go for the collaboration with the private sector to promote tourism in India, and tourism was promoted as an industry so that there are more investments in tourism, and the government then framed the National Tourism Policy 2002. The National Tourism Policy 2002 was to go for the integrated development of the tourist circuits, for example the tourist circuit in the northeast region, and to invest in the tourism infrastructure through the PPP mode, public-private partnership, and also develop the tourism product or the destination development so that we are able to sell it, we are able to market it. In 2014, the government also floated the e-tourist visa as well, and 100% FDI, foreign direct investment, was allowed in the investments in the tourism infrastructure. As per the World Economic Forum, in the Travel and Tourism Development Index 2024, India is ranked at 39th place out of 119 countries. Now, why is tourism sector significant for India? Why do we need to invest in it? Because about 10 million foreign tourists visit India every year, and it contributes to the GDP growth as well. It contributes about 5% to the GDP growth as of fiscal year 2024. And it gets us the forex earnings as well. The foreign exchange reserves, they also increase because the foreign tourists, they come and spend in India, and the forex earnings from tourism was about 2.3 lakh crore rupees in 2023. It will have a multiplier effect as well, because as tourism grows, the allied sectors also grow. For example, there is growth in the hospitality industry, there is growth in the transport industry, there is growth in the retail sector also, because the tourists, they purchase products as well, and it leads to employment generation. For example, it employs about 43 million people in India, the tourism and the allied sectors in India, the hospitality industry included. And it projects India as a soft power, because we are able to showcase our cultural heritage, historical heritage and the natural heritage to the world, and tourists are attracted to India. It also helps in building a good global image for India, as India is projected as a safe country to visit, as a safe country to tour. Now, what are the sectors across which India's tourism potential can be leveraged? We can promote cultural tourism. For example, the tourism in forts in Rajasthan, in Maharashtra, the Maratha forts, the temples in Tamil Nadu. We can promote ecotourism, the tourism to the national parks, wildlife sanctuaries, tiger reserves, the protected areas. We can promote adventure tourism, for example, tourism in the border areas, the extreme sports, medical tourism, for example, tourism to Chennai for the cheap healthcare services and hospitalization services, spiritual tourism, for example, tourism through the Char Dham Yatra, the visits to the Golden Temple in Amritsar. We can promote culinary tourism as well, for example, promoting the local delicacies like the chaat in Purani Delhi, the biryani of Hyderabad, etc. But there are certain challenges related to the tourism sector. For example, it can have an adverse ecological impact. When there is an influx of the tourists at the tourism hotspots, it can lead to litter like plastic litter, waste litter. It can be environmentally damaging, and there can be incidents of man-animal conflict, man-wildlife conflict as well. Plus, the tourism sector is dependent upon certain seasons. Like we see an influx of the tourists at the hill stations during the summer season, in the winter months also for the snow sports, etc. But there are some lean seasons as well. Then there can be the problem of crowd management. For example, if there are some auspicious days and some melas are held like Mahakumbh Mela, there can be incidents, and we have to be wary of incidents like stampedes, and the crowd has to be managed. There is a problem of infrastructure as well, especially in the remote areas. More investment has to be done for developing tourist infrastructure, development of more hotels, hospitality industry. Then the exchange rate volatility can also impact the foreign tourists who are visiting India. There is a need for the skills upgradation for the human resources as well. For example, the availability of the skilled and certified guides is poor. At the same time, there are language barriers as well. The number of guides who know English and are able to communicate with the foreign tourists is less. And the adventure tourism can also lead to the conflicts, and the natural disasters also impact the tourism adversely. For example, the Kedarnath floods. And the wildlife tourism can also lead to the man-wildlife conflict as well. Now, what are the initiatives taken up by the government to promote tourism sector in India? The government came up with the Swadesh Darshan scheme. The Swadesh Darshan scheme is to assist the state governments financially for the development of the tourist infrastructure, even with collaboration from the private sector. The Swadesh Darshan 2.0 scheme is the revamped version of the earlier scheme, assisting the state governments financially for the development of infrastructure. The Prasad scheme is for the rejuvenation of the pilgrimage sites. The central government assists the state governments financially in the rejuvenation of the identified pilgrimage sites. The Dekho Apna Desh initiative is a webinar series that is to promote India as a global tourist hub. And the battlefield tourism is also promoted by the government. For example, through initiatives like Bharat Ranbhumi Darshan app to showcase India's military heritage, and even the border tourism is also promoted through this. There is a thematic tourism promotion drive to promote the wellness tourism, culinary tourism, and the ecotourism in India. There are some other initiatives also, for example, the granting of e-visa by the government, the coming up with the regional connectivity scheme, Udan, Ude Desh Ka Aam Nagrik, to connect the small airports, to connect the remote areas also, to promote tourism there as well. And the IITF certification program, that is Incredible India Tourism Facilitator certification program, so that anybody can go and enter into the tourism industry. The database, the Nidhi database for the hospitality industry is developed. There are All India Permit Rules 2021, for which the online application can be given for getting the All India Transport and Transit Permit. The Swachh Bharat movement, ensuring the cleanliness and the sanctity of the national monuments, etc., again to promote tourism. There is a means practice question also. Tourism in India holds immense potential for economic growth, employment generation, and cultural exchange. Discuss the significance of the tourism sector in India. Also elaborate the key government initiatives aimed at promoting tourism. Please try to write it. The next article is related to the sanctions upon Russia, which have been proposed now by the European Union, and its impact on India. This is important in GS2 under the topic Effect of Politics and Policies of developed and developing countries on India's interests. The European Union has imposed sanctions upon a refinery in Gujarat, in which Rosneft, a Russian energy giant, had a 49% stake. Now, let's first have a look at the extent of the sanctions which have been imposed upon Russia already ever since there has been a conflict between Russia and Ukraine. First, there were economic sanctions upon the Russian banks, the 4 major Russian banks. And then there was the exclusion of 7 Russian banks from the SWIFT messaging system. They were disconnected from the international payments from the rest of the banks across the globe. There were asset freezes also which were taken up. The assets of the prominent Russians, including President Putin, Lavrov, and the members of the Russian Parliament or Duma, they were frozen. The assets, foreign assets of these people. There was a ban on the financial services to the Russian companies, which could not be provided across the Western nations. And there was a ban on the overflight of the European Union airspace as well. And there was a ban on all the energy and oil imports from Russia. It impacted India also. And there was an abandoning of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline project, which was to bring in gas, the energy supplies from Russia to Europe, which needs energy. And there were even sanctions against Belarus also, as it had supported the military actions of Russia. Now, what was the impact of sanctions upon Russia? It had an adverse impact upon the Russian economy. Its GDP got a shock, and even the stock exchange was frozen because it was in a free fall. Even ruble was also in a free fall, and it had a high inflation. At the same time, the global oil and gas prices also got a shock because Russia is one of the largest exporters of crude oil. It produces 12% of the world's oil and 16% of the world's natural gas. There was an impact on the agricultural exports also because Ukraine is also a significant wheat producer, and the rare metal and the mineral supply was also adversely impacted because Russia produces more than 40% of the palladium and Ukraine has 70% of the world's neon. They are needed for semiconductor chips production. And the defense exports were also impacted. Russia is the second largest defense exporter of the world, the largest being USA. Russia exports about 20% of the defense arms. Now, what was the impact on India? We had an adverse economic impact, for example, oil inflation. Although the current lowering of the oil price cap that the European Union has proposed, that the price at which the countries will be able to import from Russia, that maximum price has been limited, that may indirectly benefit India because we will be able to get the Russian oil at a cheaper price. Simultaneously, there were uncertainties regarding the rupee-ruble trade also because there is trade imbalance between India-Russia relations as well. Plus, there were citizens who were stuck in Russia and there was the choice on the sanctions. Either we go for a dollar world or a non-dollar world, because if we try to trade in the non-dollar terms, then there are threats from the US President Trump and the SWIFT bank transactions versus the other means to transact, because the Russian banks, they often face sanctions from the SWIFT as well. There is strategic impact on India also. For example, the threat of the CAATSA sanctions, countering America's adversaries through Sanctions Act, through which USA threatens to impose sanctions upon its adversaries or other countries. But half of India's military hardware comes from Russia, and therefore we need spare parts also for their maintenance, for example. And now there are even Russian investments in India, for example, rifle production in India. Plus we export BrahMos missile, we export it to Philippines, for example. And the West also has the rhetoric that either you are with us or you are against us. The Western scholars, they even say that the abstentions at the United Nations, they are not abstentions. For example, if India abstains at the United Nations, they see it as siding with Russia rather than an abstention. Also, we have to hedge our bets. For example, when Russia may be cornered, it may be expecting support from India also. Because we have had traditional ties with them, then they may be expecting support from us. And the challenge will also be to ensure that the focus of the West is not on war. Rather, there should be the focus on the cooperation in the Indo-Pacific, for example. Now coming to the article, the European Union has sanctioned a refinery in Gujarat that is owned by Naira Energy, and it is targeting Russia's energy sector. It comes at a time when the US Congress is also debating the sanctions on the purchases of the Russian crude oil. The Russian crude oil is imported by countries like India, China, Brazil, etc. Simultaneously, the European Union has also put new price caps, lower price caps, that is the price at which the purchasers of the Russian oil can purchase oil from Russia. The maximum price has been lowered from $60 per barrel to $47 per barrel. That is again to cripple Russia financially by reducing the amount of earnings that it gets through the oil exports. And this has been imposed upon the refinery because the Rosneft, a Russian energy giant, has a 49% stake in the refinery. What has been India's response? India has responded by saying that we do not subscribe to any unilateral sanction measures, and we consider the provision of energy security a responsibility of paramount importance to meet our own needs, and there should not be any double standards when it comes to energy trade. The next article is related to the geopolitics of Yemen and the case of Nimisha. This is important in GS2 under the topic Effect of Politics and Policies of Developed and Developing Countries on India's interests. Before coming to the article, let's discuss a few aspects of the background of Yemen. Yemen has been going through conflict in 2015, Saudi Arabia took military action in Yemen. That was to target the Houthis. The Houthis are Shia militias in Yemen, and they represent the marginalized Jadi community in Yemen. Saudi Arabia shares a 1400-kilometer long porous border with Yemen. Therefore, they want to install a friendly regime there. And it led to about 8-year long war. After that, there was a ceasefire of about 1 year. But the war reached a stalemate. There was no clear winner, although there were scholars who say that the Houthis were winning the war. And it led to a 6-month truce, leading to the exchange of prisoners, the easing of the blockade, and the talks for a 2-year transition period. But Yemen went through a humanitarian crisis during this time, losing about 500,000 people. And Saudi Arabia was also simultaneously anxious for a face-saving exit, because at that time China had brokered a bonhomie between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Now there were certain challenges to the peace process. The challenges include the demands by Houthis. The Houthis demanded that their commanders, they should get salaries from the government of Yemen, and they should get compensation for the war damage, the damage that they suffered. And they were also at the same time reluctant to engage with the PLC. The PLC is the Presidential Leadership Council, that is the internationally recognized Yemeni government. Now they claimed that they won the war, so in the negotiations they were having the upper hand. The standing and the credibility of the PLC was in question, and at the same time demanding the opening of the northern areas to the Houthi control. The southern province had its own concerns at the same time. That was formerly known as the Democratic Republic of Yemen. It was an independent communist country from 1967 to 1990. Now, there are competing geopolitical interests of Saudi Arabia and UAE in Yemen. UAE needs control over the ports in the South Yemen, Eritrea and Somaliland. And the backing of the Southern Transitional Council's independence is needed by Saudi Arabia because it seeks a united Yemen, because through Al-Mara it could get an oil pipeline to the Indian Ocean, thereby bypassing the Strait of Hormuz itself. Now, with the Saudi and Iran bonhomie, which was brokered earlier by China, there were concerns that the ties with Houthis will have to be amended, and at the same time the influence in Yemen will have to be retained. At the same time, the consolidation of the presence in the Red Sea will have to be done. Now coming to the article, Nimisha Priya is a Malayali nurse who is facing execution in Yemen for murder. Now a group has filed a plea in the Supreme Court seeking permission to visit Yemen and to negotiate with the victim's family there and pay the blood money to them for saving Nimisha Priya. The Supreme Court has asked the center to consider the matter on its own merits now. The next article is related to INS Nistar. This is important in GS3 under the topic Defense. Nistar means salvation in Sanskrit. INS Nistar can undertake diving and salvage operations up to 300-meter depth, and it has the DSRV capabilities, the Deep Submergence Rescue Vehicle, which can operate 1000 meters under the surface. Now, how does the deep sea rescue work? The first task is to locate the submarine which is in distress, and the usage of the remote operated vehicles and the advanced sonar system and the DSRV is taken up. If the submarine is trapped under the underwater debris, then the remote operated vehicle, the DSRV, they try to free it, as the DSRV also has the robotic arms. But the rescue window is usually small, so the priority is to save the personnel. So here is where the DSRV comes into picture, as it can attach to the hatch of the submarine, to the hatch of the disabled submarine, and the crew can be evacuated. INS Nistar is also a dive support ship with air diving capabilities for shallower depths as well. INS Nistar has been indigenously designed and constructed by the Hindustan Shipyard Limited. It is first of the 2 diving support vessels that were ordered by the Navy. Its sister ship Nipun was launched in 2022 and is expected to be commissioned soon. The original INS Nistar was a submarine rescue vehicle that we acquired from the erstwhile Soviet Union in 1969 and commissioned in 1971. But unlike its predecessor, the current INS Nistar comprises 80% indigenous content, with about 120 micro, small and medium enterprises participating in its construction, and therefore it is the first indigenously designed and constructed diving support and submarine rescue vehicle in India. Now it has both air and saturation diving systems. Moreover, it will be the mothership of the advanced deep submergence rescue vehicles. Indian Navy has already acquired two DSRVs from UK. INS Nistar can carry a 15-ton subsea crane, and it can support helicopter operations, and on board is also an operation theatre as hospital as well. So DSRV is a major milestone for India's deep sea capabilities, because as India undertakes more and more submarine operations, then we need a technologically capable platform which can take up the submarine rescue operations also, and therefore it is a strategic platform through which India can effectively become a net security provider, maritime security provider in the Indian Ocean region. And with the induction of the two DSRVs, India is now among the group of only 12 nations who have such dedicated capabilities. Earlier we used to lease them, the commercially leased platforms for the deployment of the DSRVs, which led to the limitation of the instant deployment capabilities. But now the deployment of Nistar and then deepen will change the same. Therefore we will have high transit speed and rapid deployment during emergencies, and reducing therefore the response time in the emergency scenarios where every minute matters. Based in Visakhapatnam, the Nistar will serve as the DSRV mothership in the eastern seaboard, and deepen will be based in Mumbai. And now we'll have the bilateral agreements and MOUs with other countries also. Will be able to share our submarine rescue expertise, and therefore we are positioned as a credible first responder in undersea contingencies, and it amplifies our soft power as well through the projection of India's maritime goodwill. The next article is related to the non-performing assets decline and the availability of credit. This is important in GS3 under the topic Indian economy and issues related to planning, mobilization of resources, growth, development and employment. First, let's discuss what are NPAs. The non-performing assets are those loans which have turned bad. Loan is also an asset. It has to be recovered from the person who has got the credit. But if the interest and the principal payments are overdue for 90 days or more, it is called as the non-performing asset. Now the NPAs are also classified further. The substandard assets are those assets which have remained non-performing for less than 12 months. Therefore, they have weak credit worthiness. Then there are doubtful assets which have remained as NPA for more than 12 months and was a substandard asset for 12 months. And the loss assets are those where the chance of recovery is extremely low, and even if it is recovered, it will have a very low value, then it is a loss asset. Now coming to the article, the author observes that the credit growth among the scheduled commercial banks has been declining since May 2024. What are the reasons behind this decline in the credit growth? One of the reasons is the increase in the risk weights that the RBI has attached in 2023. It made sure that the unsecured loans that did not grow at a high pace, and it accounts for about 25% of the retail credit. Their growth fell to 7.9% in March 2025 from 28% in March 2023. As the unsecured loans, their chances of becoming NPAs are higher because there are no collaterals, no guarantees. The NBFC credit, the non-banking financial companies credit, which account for 33% of the services credit, their growth also dropped to 5.7% in March 2025. But still, the NPAs in the unsecured loans have risen to 1.8% in March 2025 versus 1.5% a year ago. Another reason for the slowdown is the low floating rate loans in the private banks. The private banks give 55% of the retail loans which are linked to the external benchmark lending rate, whereas in the PSBs this proportion is higher, close to 60%. Therefore, there is a better rate transmission, because as and when the repo rate is reduced, the external benchmark linked rate is reduced, the rate which is charged by the bank from the borrower is also reduced. Therefore, the credit growth from the public sector banks has increased. There is a shift from the private to the public banks. The PSB credit growth is about 12% in fiscal year 2025, whereas for the private it is 9.5%. It is the lowest since fiscal year 2021. The PSB share in the incremental credit is 56% in fiscal year 2025 versus just 20% in fiscal year 18. Now, there has been simultaneously improvement in the asset quality also. For example, the gross non-performing assets have declined to a multi-decade low of 2.3% recently. The provision coverage has also increased due to the strict regulations from RBI to 76.3%. The NPAs from the MSMEs likewise have fallen to 3.6% from 10.8% 4 years ago, and the MSME credit growth is close to 18% as compared to 5 to 7% in 2011-2013. Now, what are the reasons behind the credit revival for the MSMEs? It has been because of the formalization push from the side of the government. For example, the URN seeding, the cutting of the threshold for the trades, that the MSMEs are able to get money using their trade receivables through the trades platform, even for the 250 crore rupees also. And the government guarantees given to ensure the MSMEs credit, enhanced cover is provided for the MSME borrowers, and even the serious delinquencies have also come down to 1.8% for the MSMEs, that is at a 5-year low. Now, what are the broader trends? We can see that the corporates, they have been diversifying their funding sources, not only getting funds from the scheduled commercial banks, rather from the floating of commercial papers, the external commercial borrowings, as well as from the capital markets. The corporates have been deleveraging as well. For example, holding more cash. The cash holdings have gone up by 18-19% from fiscal year 2024 to 2025. The household savings have also shifted from the banks to equities. The equity share was 2.5% in fiscal year 20, now it has gone to 5% in fiscal year 2024. In comparison to China, it is still low. In China, the household savings go to equities, 9% of them. But still, the bank deposit growth is required. The bank deposit growth is critical for ensuring the credit growth as well. The next article is related to the feeding of stray dogs, a debate between compassion and public order. This is important in GS2 under the topic governance. The case started with the harassment of a Noida resident who filed a case for harassment for feeding the stray dogs in the common areas in the society. The Allahabad High Court ruled that we have to consider the concern of the common man. There is a fear of the attacks by the stray dog. It acknowledged the Animal Birth Control Rules 2023, but it prioritized public safety and it dismissed the plea filed by the Noida resident. Now, when we look at the legal framework, we have the Animal Birth Control Rules 2023. These rules replace the earlier 2001 rules, and rather than using the word stray, the word community animal was used, and it mandated sterilization, vaccination and the regulated feeding of the community animals. When we look at the constitutional protections, Article 21 provides for the right to life and personal liberty. The Supreme Court in the Jallikattu case extended the right to life and personal liberty to the animals also. Additionally, we have the fundamental duty under Article 51A subclause G to have compassion towards all living creatures. Now, the feeding guidelines are mentioned under Rule 20 of the Animal Birth Control Rules, which mandate that the RWA, the Resident Welfare Association, must facilitate the feeding, and there should be designated feeding spots, but they should be away from the entrances, staircases or the play areas. At the same time, the area should be clean, litter free, and there should be fixed timings for the feeding. And in case there is a dispute, the dispute resolution should be done by involving the veterinary officer, the police, the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty for Animals and the RWA. Now, earlier also in a case, the Bombay High Court in 2023 observed in the Sharmila Sankar case that the RWAs can't ban feeding or penalize the caregivers, and the Animal Birth Control Rules are legally binding. Now, in the present case, the Supreme Court has suggested that the dogs can be fed inside the homes by the caregivers to avoid public disputes, and we need to balance animal welfare versus communal harmony. Thank you.